Wood. Shrapnel the size of hunting knives erupts across the freezing stone. Alpha Harlan Royce hits the floor hard enough to crack the granite beneath his spine. A heavy, iron-soled boot crushes his jaw directly against the rock, grinding bone against stone. Blood pools rapidly around his teeth, staining the gray floorboards a brilliant crimson. Killing blow begins to descend. Then the cavernous room shatters with the deafening crack of raw ozone. Frost climbs the tall stone walls instantly, freezing the heavy curtains into rigid boards. 10-foot beast made entirely of churning black smoke and piercing blue light materializes directly over the broken Alpha. It completely ignores the invading warlord standing above him. The monster turns its terrifying, luminous gaze toward the darkest corner of the hall. Standing there is the estate's invisible, mud-stained Maid. Her eyes glow with the exact same unnatural, violent fire. 72 hours earlier. Caustic lie burns deeply into the open cracks of Cora Vance's knuckles. She scrubs the rigid floorboards of the great hall until the joints in her fingers lock entirely. The water in her heavy wooden bucket is slate gray with tracked-in dirt, already freezing over at the outer edges. Winter in the Cascade Mountains does not respect thick stone walls. Brutal drafts howl relentlessly through the chinks in the heavy timber framing. Her tattered, moth-eaten wool dress offers zero protection against the biting chill creeping steadily up from the root cellar. She focuses entirely on the coarse, stiff bristles of her brush scraping violently against the stubborn oak. Rhythm is her only survival tactic. 1 stroke forward, 2 strokes back. Ignore the painful numbness settling permanently into her toes. Yet, the agonizing hunger twisting her stomach into tight, cramping knots keep the head down. Remain entirely unseen. The shadow wolf writhes violently beneath her lower ribs. It is a primordial parasite comprised of smoke and pure rage, bound to her bloodline by ancient rituals she tries daily to forget. Right now, the entity hates the bitter cold. It utterly despises the subjugation. A low, vibrating hum reverberates constantly through her chest cavity, pressing hard against her lungs, demanding immediate release. Cora tightens her jaw, tasting sharp copper as she accidentally bites the inside of her cheek. She forces the terrifying entity down into the deepest, darkest pit of her exhausted mind. Letting it out means the entire Blackwood estate burns to white ash. She absolutely cannot afford to be hunted again. Heavy, deliberate footsteps violently shake the floorboards directly behind her. Harlan Royce strides purposefully into the great hall. He reeks of stale amber whiskey, wet canine fur, and suffocating, unchecked arrogance. His massive, steel-toed leather boots leave fresh, thick tracks of black mud across the exact stones she just spent an agonizing hour cleaning. The Alpha of the Blackwood Ridge Timber Pack carries himself exactly like a king, ruling over a rapidly rotting castle. He does not bother to look at her. Harlan never looks at the people he strictly considers beneath his notice. She is just a broken omega to him, a completely wolfless runt kept around simply to scrape the filthy grime off his boots. His heavy boot catches the side of her wooden bucket. Aged wood splinters loudly, a sharp, violent crack echoing intensely through the cavernous room. Filthy, freezing water floods rapidly across the floorboards, soaking immediately into Cora's threadbare skirt and instantly freezing against her bare knees. She stops scrubbing instantly. The lie bites sharply into the raw flesh of her hands as she presses them flat against the rough stone just to keep her fragile balance. "Clean it up," Harlan grunts. He steps right over her, trailing even more mud toward the massive, unlit stone fireplace. Declan Hayes follows exactly one step behind him. Tall, broad-shouldered beta enforcer pauses for a mere fraction of a second, glancing down at the ruined, splintered bucket and the violently shivering girl. Declan says absolutely nothing. He just adjusts his heavy leather gun belt and continues walking, fully complicit in the casual cruelty. Cora remains perfectly still on her knees. She gathers the jagged, sharp, splintered wood of her broken bucket. She wipes the caustic, burning chemical sludge carefully from her bleeding fingers, feeling the vicious sting travel all the way up her forearms. Some stains never wash out of the wood. Just like the truth of this isolated estate, if you want to see the exact moment the Alpha realizes he has been stepping on a god, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Blood is already on the floorboards. She pushes herself up slowly from the freezing puddle. Her wet, heavy skirt clings tightly to her legs, chilling her deep into the bone marrow. Every single muscle in her lower back protests sharply as she carries the broken, jagged pieces over to the massive hearth. Firelight dances wildly across Harlan's rugged face. He pours himself a very tall glass of dark amber liquid, completely ignoring the quietly shivering woman standing a mere 10 feet away. The northern logging camps are entirely quiet, Declan says, leaning heavily against the dark wood mantel. Way too quiet for the middle of midwinter. Harlan swallows his strong drink in one massive gulp. They are starving, Declan. Completely freeze in the dark. Boone Thatcher is getting incredibly desperate. Desperation makes stupid men do stupid things, Harlan sneers, slamming his heavy glass down onto the table. If Boone Thatcher even attempts to cross the ridge, we mount his severed head directly on the front gates. Cora carefully sweeps the wet splinters into the roaring flames. The intense fire crackles aggressively, quickly consuming the ruined wood. She keeps her pale face totally blank. Vicious beast inside her chest stirs violently again, actively sensing the Alpha's completely blind arrogance. It constantly feeds on such glaring weakness. Harlan's massive overconfidence is a festering, open wound, and the dark shadow wolf desperately wants to rip it entirely wide open. She digs her short fingernails deep into her palms until the thin skin nearly breaks, anchoring her racing mind to the grounding physical pain. Agonizing hours bleed slowly into night. The massive great hall completely transforms from a quiet, freezing cavern into a raucous, suffocating, deafening den of deafening noise and oppressive heat. Dozens of massive Blackwood enforcers crowd around the deeply scarred oak tables. They are huge, hardened individuals shaped by brutal years of felling massive timber and barely surviving the Cascade winters. Enormous metal platters piled high with freshly roasted venison and charred, smoking root vegetables cover every square inch of the wooden tables. Thick scent of rendering animal fat and dark, bitter ale is incredibly overwhelming in the enclosed space. Heavy iron axes lean haphazardly against the stone walls. Hunting rifles sit stacked securely near the main entrance doors. Pack is heavily armed, yet utterly defenseless against what is truly hiding inside the room. Cora observes all of this carefully. She catalogs their impressive weapons. She calculates exactly how long it would realistically take the Shadow Wolf to slaughter every single heavily armed man in the room. 3 seconds. Maybe 4 at the absolute most. The grim knowledge is a heavy, terrible burden she carries silently. She stands completely still in the drafty, cold shadows near the large kitchen archway. Her dark uniform is still uncomfortably damp. She holds a very heavy cast-iron pitcher full of water, waiting patiently for a direct command. Strict protocol dictates she absolutely cannot move a muscle unless explicitly called upon. She watches the loud pack gorge themselves aggressively, her own empty stomach violently hollow and cramping painfully. Uproarious laughter erupts suddenly from the head of the long table. Harlan sits comfortably in a massive, oversized wooden chair, draped heavily in thick brown bear fur. He holds a large animal bone, tearing the tough meat off forcefully with his bare teeth. Hot grease coats his stubbled chin. He looks directly down the entire length of the hall, his sharp eyes locking firmly onto Cora, hiding quietly in the dim, flickering light. "You!" Harlan barks loudly, pointing a grease-stained, thick finger toward the archway. "Bring the water here." She steps forward immediately. Her thin, worn shoes make absolutely no sound on the hard stone. She approaches his massive chair, keeping her dark eyes firmly and obediently fixed on the dirty floorboards. The deafening noise in the large hall dips very slightly. The surrounding enforcers watch intently, sensing their cruel alpha's sudden, deep need for dark entertainment. She lifts the heavy, cast-iron pitcher. Her exhausted muscles tremble violently from pure fatigue. Clear water splashes perfectly into his battered metal cup. She begins to pull her aching arms away. Harlan snatches her thin wrist. His crushing grip is exactly like a rusted steel trap. Cora freezes instantly. The heavy iron pitcher wobbles dangerously in her other trembling hand. "Look directly at me," he commands fiercely. Cora forces her stiff chin up slowly. She meets his aggressive gaze. His irises are distinctly yellow in the bright firelight, heavily dilated with strong alcohol and pure dominance. "You are visibly shaking." Harlan mocks cruelly, his booming voice carrying easily over the totally silent room. "Are you cold, little runt?" She says absolutely nothing. Her total silence infuriates his fragile ego. He desperately wants her to beg. He wants her to whimper pathetically like a heavily beaten dog. Dark entity directly beneath her pale skin snarls viciously in the dark, hidden corners of her mind. The ambient temperature immediately around them instantly plummets 10 degrees. Bright white frost begins to form rapidly on the metallic edges of the cup resting on the table. Harlan does not notice the incredibly sudden, unnatural freeze. He reaches lazily over to his messy plate and picks up a thick, incredibly tough scrap of useless gristle. He tosses it carelessly onto the dirty floorboards right at her scuffed shoes. "Eat it," Harlan says flatly. The entire room erupts instantly into cruel, mocking laughter. Massive pack members bang their heavy cups aggressively against the scarred wood. Cora stares directly down at the greasy, discarded scrap. The intense indignity burns significantly hotter than the caustic lie currently blistering her raw knuckles. The primordial shadow wolf surges forward violently, crashing aggressively against the fragile mental barriers she has carefully built. It desperately wants to manifest. Physically, it wants to eagerly wrap its massive, crushing jaws completely around Harlan's arrogant skull and shatter it into fine powder. Her peripheral vision edges sharply with glowing blue light. The heavy pitcher, currently in her tight grip, begins to frost over completely. Cora blinks incredibly hard. She violently and painfully suppresses the surging magic, shoving it forcefully back down into the empty void. She slowly, agonizingly bends her trembling knees, lowering herself completely to the dirty floor. She picks up the incredibly cold piece of gristle with her bare, blistered fingers. She absolutely does not eat it. She simply holds it tightly, keeping her dark eyes glued intensely to the mud, permanently caked on his boots. Harlan scoffs loudly in utter disgust. Completely pathetic. Get entirely out of my sight. She rises very quickly and backs away silently into the cold shadows. The deafening laughter immediately resumes. The loud pack returns quickly to their aggressive feast, completely oblivious to how incredibly close they all just came to absolute, bloody annihilation. Cora leans heavily against the incredibly cold stone wall hidden in the dark corridor, gasping desperately for thin air. Tight chest heaves violently. The severe physical toll of forcefully restraining the massive beast leaves her incredibly dizzy and deeply nauseous. Thick black veins briefly pulse visibly along her pale neck, before fading back quickly into normal skin. Massive, heavy oak doors located at the far end of the great hall suddenly slam violently open. The loud noise dies completely and instantly. Declan Hayes stands rigidly in the wide doorway. He brings the howling, freezing winter wind directly inside with him. Thick white snow clings heavily to his dark leather coat. His normally stoic face is entirely drained of all living color. The beta enforcer walks incredibly slowly toward the head table. Every single eye present in the massive room follows his grim, silent progression. Declan is a hardened veteran of the frontier, accustomed to bear attacks and logging accidents. But his scarred hands are trembling visibly. He knows this particular discovery is completely different. Harlan stands up quickly, wiping the shiny grease violently from his rough mouth. What exactly is it? Declan reaches deeply into his heavy coat. He pulls out a thick, rigid leather strap completely covered in dried, flaky blood and matted gray fur. He drops it directly onto the exact center of the feasting table. The heavy, scratched metal buckle clatters loudly against the hard wood. It is a border sentry collar. I found it physically nailed to a large pine tree exactly 1 mile from the western ridge, Declan says, his voice incredibly tight and strained. There were absolutely no tracks. There is no body. Just this. Harlan stares intensely at the bloody leather collar. His square jaw tightens visibly. The unchecked arrogance wavers slightly for a mere fraction of a second before he violently reasserts it. Scavengers. Boon-starving, pathetic rats are getting bold. They successfully crossed the established boundary line, Harlan. Brutal killed Silas. Silas was incredibly weak. Harlan roars furiously, slamming his massive fist down onto the table. Thick wood groans terribly under the severe impact. Immediately double the border patrols. Shoot absolutely anything that moves in the dark timber. I will absolutely not have my pack cowering in fear over one single dead sentry. The surrounding enforcers nod quickly, feeding directly off their alpha's aggressive, blind confidence. Sudden tension, briefly in the room, dissipates slowly into angry, violent murmurs. They foolishly dismiss the immediate threat. They truly believe their large numbers and their thick stone walls will successfully keep them completely safe from the encroaching winter. The deep shadows of the quiet corridor, Cora watches the bloody leather collar resting ominously among the scattered plates of half-eaten food. She takes a very slow, deep, shuddering breath. The faint scent hits her immediately. Underneath the strong smell of stale, canine blood and wet fur, there is definitely something else entirely. She smells deep, ancient, unnatural frost. She smells the sharp metallic tang of raw ozone and rotting decayed pine. Her blood runs completely ice cold. Boone Thatcher is absolutely not sending random scavengers. He is not merely desperate for fresh food or more territory. Cora recognizes that incredibly specific, highly unnatural scent clinging heavily to the leather. It is the distinct scent of a brutal tracker using very dark, very ancient blood magic. She knows exactly who is rapidly coming. More importantly, she knows exactly what they are currently hunting. They are not here for Harlan Royce. They are here for her. Cora turns completely away from the warm light of the great hall. She moves silently and rapidly down the narrow, freezing stone corridors directly toward the servant quarters. Thick stone walls feel significantly closer together than they did just this morning. The freezing air is rapidly thinning out. The massive estate is no longer a miserable prison. It is a highly active trap. She pushes open the flimsy, warped wooden door to her tiny room. It is a completely windowless, incredibly freezing concrete box, barely large enough for a stiff cot and a cracked ceramic wash basin. There is absolutely no fireplace. There are no thick blankets. She sits rigidly on the very edge of the stiff, freezing mattress. The absolute dark consumes her completely. For the very first time in 3 long, agonizing years, Cora Vance totally stops fighting the heavy restraints. She lets her ironclad concentration slip for just a single, utterly terrifying second. Her physical shadow completely detaches from the cold stone wall. It pools deeply on the floor, growing incredibly massive and horribly distorted. 2 piercing, brilliant blue eyes open suddenly in the pitch darkness of the tiny room. Terrifying entity rises up quickly, a towering, suffocating silhouette of dense smoke and pure, unadulterated malice. It stretches out a massive, sharply clawed appendage and violently scrapes it directly against the incredibly frost-bitten glass of the small, square, clerestory window located near the ceiling. The resulting sound is exactly like raw steel grinding forcefully against solid ice as the distant, overlapping howls of Boone Thatcher's slaughter pack echo across the timberline. Ice crystals shredded the skin around Declan Hayes's fingernails. He plunged his bare hands deeper into the compacted snowdrift. The freezing bite was immediate, numbing his wrists instantly, but he did not stop digging. Heavy mountain winds whipped granular snow against his leather duster. He found purchase on something solid buried beneath the frost. It was rigid. It was covered in coarse, frozen hair. Declan hauled backward. The severed, frost-bitten head of Miller, their lead border sentry, breached the snowbank. The grisly trophy hit the icy ground with a heavy wooden thud. Miller's jaw was locked open in a silent, permanent scream. His retinas were completely clouded over with white ice. The immediate stench rolling off the severed neck was nauseating. It was a vicious cocktail of rotting pine resin, frozen copper, and the sharp, acidic reek of pure canine fear. Declan wiped slush from his bloody fingers. He slowly stood up. His boots crunched heavily against the frozen crust of the earth. He stared past the mutilated sentry. Dense, skeletal tree line of the northern ridge loomed ahead. The pale white bark of the birch trees was entirely desecrated. Dozens of massive, bloody handprints smeared across the trunks. They started low as in the snow and climbed 8 feet high into the branches. The invaders had not just killed the sentry. They had scaled the perimeter trees, watching the estate from above. They were already inside the territory. The great hall was suffocatingly hot. A massive fire roared in the central hearth, throwing erratic, violent light across the war council. The air tasted stale. It reeked of sour sweat, spilled bourbon, and the greasy remnants of the feast. Paranoia had officially infected the Blackwood pack. Harlan Royce paced the length of a heavy oak table. His heavy boots hammered against the floorboards. His jaw ticked. His amber eyes darted toward the frosted windows, constantly searching the shifting shadows outside. A massive hand-drawn map of the logging empire lay pinned to the wood, completely covered in scattered wooden markers. They hit the western camp. Harlan snarled, pointing a thick, calloused finger at the parchment. 2 hours ago, tore the throats out of 4 lumberjacks and burned the primary storehouse to the ground. "It is a distraction," Declan replied flatly. He stood rigidly near the fire, his leather coat still dripping. Melting snow onto the stones are bleeding the perimeter to draw our enforcers out into the trees. "Then we hunt them in the trees," Harlan roared. He slammed his fist down, sending a wooden marker skittering across the table. "We take 30 wolves. We push straight up the mountain and slaughter every starving mutt we find in the snow." Cora Vance stood silently in the periphery of the firelight. The heavy crystal bourbon decanter in her hands felt like a block of solid lead. The glass dug painfully into the raw, chemical burns on her palms. She kept her eyes locked on the floorboards, pouring amber liquid into empty glasses with robotic, practiced precision. The shadow wolf beneath her ribs was entirely awake. It thrashed against her internal organs. It did not feel fear. It tasted the sour, acidic stench of terror rolling off Harlan and his lieutenants. The entity savored it. It pulled the ambient panic into Cora's lungs, transforming it into freezing, electrical static. "A blind charge into a blizzard is exactly what they want," Declan argued. He stepped away from the hearth. "Our wolves are heavy. They are fed. They are slow. The northern packs have been starving since October. They are feral, Harlan. They will string your enforcers up in the canopy before you even draw a blade." "You speak of them like they are ghosts, Beta. I speak of them like predators who just sheared an iron collar with their teeth." Cora moved to the head of the table. She reached forward to refill Harlan's glass. Her muscles locked tight. Atmospheric pressure immediately around her dropped 2 degrees. Bourbon inside the crystal decanter turned sluggish. Harlan's stopped pacing. He leaned over the map, planting both palms heavily on the edges. His knuckles were entirely white. "Boone Thatcher is leading them," Harlan spat. The name dripped with venom and deep-seated insecurity. "That starved, rotting carcass of an alpha thinks he can march into my timber and claim my meat lockers." The name acted like a physical spark, hitting a powder keg. Entity inside Cora violently rejected the restraint. A concussive wave of freezing energy spiked through her forearms. Pressure inside the heavy glass decanter violently expanded. The thick crystal exploded in her hands. Shards of razor-sharp glass erupted outward in a deadly spray. Amber bourbon splashed heavily across the war map, soaking instantly into the dry parchment. Sudden, violent shattering sound snapped the tension in the room like a dry twig. Total silence crashed down on the hall. Half a dozen enforcers instantly dropped their hands to the heavy blades, strapped to their thighs. Cora stared at her empty hands. Blood welled up from a deep, jagged slice across her left palm. It dripped steadily onto the ruined map. The dark crimson blood mixed with the spilled alcohol. Harlan slowly turned his head. His eyes locked onto the maid. The arrogant facade cracked completely, revealing the ugly, terrified tyrant underneath. He did not see a supernatural threat. He saw a pathetic, wolfless servant whose clumsiness had just humiliated him in front of his war council. He lunged forward. His heavy, backhanded strike connected violently with the side of Cora's jaw. The sheer force of the blow lifted her entirely off her feet. She slammed hard into the uneven stone floor. Her shoulder took the brunt of the impact, tearing the worn wool of her dress. Her head bounced once against the rock. Her vision fractured into a dizzying array of gray, static and sharp white light. "It's useless garbage out of my sight," Harlan bellowed. His chest heaved rapidly. "Clean this mess up. Lock the gates. Nobody sleeps tonight." Cora tasted raw copper. She slowly pushed herself up onto her hands and knees. The side of her face throbbed with a sickening, hot rhythm. She did not look up. She pressed her bleeding palm against the cold stone, forcing the parasite back down her throat. She swallowed the jagged black smoke threatening to spill past her teeth. She crawled backward into the shadows, letting the darkness consume her entirely. 5 miles north of the Blackwood estate, the temperature dropped to 20 below zero. The timberline offered zero protection from the screaming wind. Boone Thatcher crouched on the edge of a jagged granite cliff. He stared down at the sprawling, fortified lumber compound in the valley below. The alpha of the northern slaughter pack was dangerously lean. His skin was stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His heavy fur coat was matted with dried blood and frozen mud. His eyes, completely devoid of human warmth, burned a sickly, luminescent yellow in the dark. He dragged a long, filthy fingernail across a stolen surveyor's map pinned beneath his knee. A massive, hulking enforcer stepped out of the swirling snow behind him. The subordinate wolf was missing half of his left ear. Ice clung to his ragged beard. "The western camp is Ash's Alpha," the enforcer grunted. 4 dead. The lumberjacks are fleeing south toward the main estate. "We can take the meat lockers now. Our pups are starving." Boone did not turn around. He kept his feral gaze locked on the glowing amber windows of Harlan's great hall down in the valley. "Ignore the meat lockers," Boone rasped. His voice sounded like dry gravel grinding against bone. "Inother the gold vaults. Ignore the lumber mills." The hulking enforcer stepped closer, confusion overriding his strict submission. "Alpha, we have not eaten fresh kill in 3 weeks. Royce has winter stores piling up to the rafters. We can butcher the estate guards and take the food." Boone stood up slowly. He pivoted on his heel. He grabbed the enforcer by the front matted furs and violently slammed him back against the trunk of a dead pine tree. The heavy impact shook dry snow from the high branches. "You smell roasted venison," Boone hissed, leaning directly into the subordinate's face. "You smell cheap bourbon and fat lumberjacks. You smell like a scavenger." Boone released the furs and stepped back. He tilted his head up toward the howling storm. He opened his mouth, pulling the freezing wind over his sharp teeth. "Smell the ozone," Boone whispered. A sickening, greedy smile cracked his frozen lips. "I smell the static. It rolled right off that sentry's broken collar." He looked back down into the valley. Royce is a blind fool sitting on top of a gold mine. He does not even realize what is scrubbing his floors. The ancient magic is trapped inside those walls, primordial god of shadows. Boone's yellow eyes widened with manic obsession. We breached the main gates. We slaughter every wolf standing in our way. I do not care about the timber. I want the girl. He kicked snow over the stolen map. I am going to eat her heart, and I am going to become the storm. The whiteout blizzard slammed into the Blackwood estate 3 hours before dawn. It completely isolated the compound. The wind shrieked against the heavy log walls, searching for weaknesses in the chinking. Dense, horizontal snow reduced visibility in the courtyard to absolutely zero. Pressure cooker was officially sealed tight. Inside the subterranean kitchens, the air was suffocatingly damp and bitterly cold. The iron stoves had died out hours ago. Cora knelt alone on the cracked tile floor. The absolute isolation of the room offered no comfort. The claustrophobia was crushing her lungs. The internal dam was rapidly disintegrating. Cora doubled over. A violent, wet cough racked her spine. She slapped both hands over her mouth. The sound was muffled, but the physical expulsion was entirely unstoppable. Thick, unnatural black smoke erupted past her lips. It poured through her fingers, spilling onto the tiles like heavy, dark water. The smoke hissed wildly upon hitting the freezing air. It twisted and coiled, briefly forming jagged claws and snapping jaws before evaporating into the shadows. Every cough tore at her esophagus. It felt like swallowing broken glass and exhaling battery acid. Parasite was ravaging her internal organs. It was feeding on the panic, radiating from the armed guards stationed in the corridors above. The sheer volume of fear saturating the estate was acting like an accelerant. She gripped the edges of a deep stone sink. She hauled her trembling body upward. She stared at her own reflection in a cracked piece of mirrored glass leaning against the stone wall. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. The veins tracking up her neck were completely black, pulsing violently with dark magic. Her eyes flickered. The irises rapidly shifted from dull brown to blinding, luminescent blue. She choked out another mouthful of static and shadow. It pooled in the bottom of the dry stone sink, burning a faint scorch mark into the rock. The physical toll was unsustainable. Agonizing headache behind her eyes throbbed in time with the roaring blizzard outside. The monster was clawing its way up her throat. It wanted out. It wanted to hunt. Cora pressed her forehead against the freezing stone wall. Her bruised jaw ached fiercely from Harlan's strike. Blood on her hand had dried into stiff, dark flakes. She realized the terrifying truth with absolute clarity. She could not hide the entity for another night. The walls were closing in. The slaughter was imminent. If Boone Thatcher did not kill her, the parasite tearing apart her chest cavity absolutely would. Upstairs, the heavy, rhythmic stomping of boots echoed through the ceiling. Harlan was gathering his enforcers in the great hall. The final defensive stand. Cora turned away from the mirror. She wiped the lingering black soot from her cracked lips. She picked up a heavy iron meat cleaver resting on the wooden butcher block. It was a pathetic, mortal weapon against what was coming. But she needed the cold iron anchoring her hands. She walked slowly toward the dark stairwell. The great hall was a powder keg of heavily armed, terrified men. 40 Blackwood enforcers stood shoulder to shoulder. They gripped heavy iron axes, hunting rifles, and serrated machetes. The massive central fire threw towering, distorted shadows against the log walls. Harlan stood directly in front of the roaring hearth. His leather duster was unbuttoned, revealing a heavy bandolier of ammunition strapped across his chest. He held a massive, double-barreled shotgun in his right hand. Declan Hayes stood 2 paces behind him, his expression grim and completely stoic. Harlan raised his voice over the deafening shriek of the wind rattling the high windows. "This estate belongs to the Blackwood bloodline," Harlan boomed. His voice bounced aggressively off the stone walls. "We built this empire from the dirt. We broke this mountain. No starving pack of northern strays is going to walk into my hall and take my timber." The enforcers roared in aggressive agreement. They slammed the butts of their rifles against the floorboards. The noise was chaotic, desperate, and entirely meant to mask their underlying terror. "Thatcher wants a war in the snow?" Harlan yelled, pacing aggressively in front of the flames. "We give him a slaughter. We hold the gates. We let them break their teeth on our iron. We are the apex predators of this ridge. We are invincible!" Harlan raised his shotgun into the air. Mid-sentence, the heavy reinforced oak logs of the main courtyard gates emitted a deafening, metallic shriek. The massive iron hinges completely sheared off the stone. The heavy wooden beams exploded inward with the concussive force of a detonating bomb. Rusted iron shrapnel, shattered oak splinters, and an avalanche of driving white snow violently showered the interior of the great hall. 3 enforcers standing near the entrance were instantly impaled by flying wood. They dropped to the stones in a heap of tangled limbs and spurting blood. Brutal, freezing wind of the mountain ripped through the gaping hole in the wall, instantly extinguishing the massive hearth fire. Complete, suffocating darkness swallowed the room. Sanctuary is breached. The countdown has hit 0, and Harlan is about to pay the toll for his arrogance. Total, deafening slaughter consumed the great hall. The immediate aftermath of the reinforced oak gates exploding inward was a blinding blur of tearing flesh and splintering furniture. Massive iron hinges shattered against the uneven stone floor, sending rusted shrapnel tearing through the front line of Blackwood defenders. Brutal, freezing wind of the mountain ripped through the gaping breach. It instantly extinguished the massive central hearth fire. Complete darkness threatened to swallow the room, held back only by the faint, eerie glow of the moon, reflecting off the driving snow outside. Dozens of starving northern wolves surged through the broken walls. They did not move with organized frontier discipline. They moved with feral, chaotic speed. Heavy, wet thuds echoed rapidly against the cold stones. Blackwood enforcers dropped dead across the overturned oak dining tables. The metallic tang of fresh blood violently overpowered the scent of spilled bourbon. Freezing breath plumed from the snapping jaws of the invaders. They swung crude, jagged machetes blindly in the dim light. Rusted blades sheared through thick leather dusters and the warm flesh beneath. Well-fed Blackwood guards were entirely unprepared for the raw desperation of starvation. The invaders ignored defensive blocks, took heavy blows to their own shoulders, merely to get their teeth closer to the throats of their enemies. Harlan Royce fought fiercely near the ruined hearth. He swung the heavy wooden stock of his double-barreled shotgun into the jaw of a leaping attacker. Bone crunched loudly. Blood sprayed across the alpha's face. He racked a shell. He fired blindly into the mass of gray fur and matted coats pouring through the entrance. The deafening blast illuminated the carnage for a fraction of a second. The flash revealed a complete massacre. It was entirely useless. Brute force meant absolutely nothing against a starving tide. 3 massive northern wolves tackled the alpha simultaneously. They slammed him violently into the unyielding floorboards. The heavy shotgun skittered uselessly into the shadows, clattering against a broken chair leg. Heavy, steel-toed boots kicked Harlan repeatedly in the ribs. He gasped for air, tasting only freezing snow and loose dirt. A massive, filthy fist twisted violently into Harlan's dark hair. The attacker dragged the screaming alpha backward across the uneven floorboards. The rough wood scraped aggressively against his leather coat. They hurled him toward the center of the room. He crashed hard onto the exact stones Cora Vance had scrubbed with caustic lye mere hours earlier. The battle around them began to slow. The disorganized Blackwood men were swiftly butchered. The survivors dropped their weapons, falling to their knees in absolute terror. Boone Thatcher walked casually through the active carnage. He stepped cleanly over the mutilated bodies of the estate guards. The northern warlord was dangerously lean, his skin stretched tight over sharp, hollow cheekbones. His matted fur coat dripped with melting snow and fresh gore sirt. He stopped directly above Harlan. Boone looked down at the bleeding timber baron. He treated the alpha like a piece of broken, discarded furniture blocking his path. Harlan spat a mouthful of dark blood onto Boone's spiked boot. "You think you can hold my timber?" Harlan snarled. His voice was ragged, choked with pain and lingering, arrogant delusion. "My southern camps will march by dawn." Boone threw his head back. A jagged, gravelly laugh scraped against the stone-sown walls. It sounded like 2 rough stones grinding together. "Timber." Boone shook his head slowly. "You arrogant blind fool." Boone stepped entirely over Harlan's paralyzed form. He ignored the bleeding alpha completely. The warlord turned his glowing yellow eyes toward the dark corner of the kitchen passage. He stared directly at the shadows. He stared at the cowering Maid. Cora Vance stood frozen against the log wall. She gripped a heavy iron meat cleaver in her raw, chemically burned hands. The cold metal offered absolutely no comfort. Her knuckles were entirely white. The dark veins, tracking up her neck, pulsed violently with suppressed magic. "Look around you, Royce," Boone hissed. His voice carried clearly over the dying moans of the Blackwood pack. "Look at what you kept locked in your basement." Harlan slowly turned his battered head against the wet stone. His amber eyes locked onto Cora. Total, paralyzing shock fractured his worldview. He stared at the bruised, bleeding girl he had beaten merely hours ago. "Kept a primordial god scrubbing your floors," Boone announced to the ruined hall. "You treated her like dirt while the ancient magic slept right under your boots. You threw mud on a weapon that could level this entire mountain." Harlan stared at the maid. The arrogant facade completely disintegrated. The realization physically hollowed him out. His entire hierarchy, his absolute belief in his own supreme power, was a total lie. He was not the apex predator. He had never been the apex predator. He was merely a loud insect, living in the shadow of a sleeping giant. Boone took a slow, deliberate step toward the kitchen passage. "You smell it now, do you not?" Boone asked the room, inhaling the freezing air deeply. The static, the ozone, the storm. He pointed a jagged, blood-stained claw directly at Cora's chest. "I am going to crack your ribs open, girl," Boone promised. His yellow eyes widened with manic, starving obsession. "I am going to rip that entity from your lungs." I am going to consume the shadow." Cora stared at the feral warlord. The chemical burns on her hands throbbed. Her bruised jaw ached fiercely. She looked at the blood pooling around Harlan Royce. She looked at the starving monsters closing in on her corner. She opened her fingers. The heavy iron cleaver dropped. It clanged loudly against the floorboards. She stopped fighting the cage. The internal dam completely shattered. The ambient temperature inside the ruined hall instantly plummeted to sub-zero. A concussive shockwave of pure, freezing atmospheric pressure exploded outward from her frail body. The sheer force of the invisible wave flattened the surrounding northern enforcers onto their knees. Moisture in the air instantly froze, filling the room with a thick, swirling white mist. The shadow wolf detonated. It did not climb slowly out of her skin. It violently erupted. A localized hurricane of jagged, inky shadows and blinding blue lightning exploded from her chest cavity. The massive, 10-foot beast materialized directly over the broken Alpha. The entity was forged entirely from churning black smoke and freezing static. Its eyes burned with unnatural, piercing blue fire. It completely dwarfed every living creature in the room. The beast did not bite. It did not use mortal claws. The monster manifested as crushing, physical gravity. Boone lunged forward with a desperate, feral scream, raising his machete to strike the manifestation. The shadow wolf simply looked at him. A localized vacuum of dark energy slammed into the northern Alpha. Boone hit an invisible, solid wall of pressure mid-stride. He collapsed instantly onto the stone. The sheer weight of the shadows pinned him completely flat. His limbs splayed out awkwardly. The horrific sound of grinding bone echoed through the freezing air. The entity was actively crushing his ribs to powder. Boone gasped frantically, his jaw snapping open, but the shadow ripped the heat directly from his lungs. It denied him oxygen. He suffocated in the open air. His starving enforcers scrambled backward in absolute panic. They dropped their weapons. They clawed desperately at their own throats. Invisible vacuums suffocated them where they stood. The atmospheric pressure squeezed their skulls. Blue lightning arced violently across the heavy wooden ceiling beams, shattering the remaining frosted glass in the high windows. Total, visceral awe consumed the surviving Blackwood wolves. They pressed themselves completely flat against the log walls. They were absolutely terrified of moving a single muscle. The false gods of the frontier were completely erased. The true apex predator had finally taken the room. The shadow beast slowly turned its massive, shifting head. It looked down at Boone Thatcher. Warlord's yellow eyes rolled entirely back into his skull. Blood leaked from his nose and ears. His broken body went entirely limp against the stone. The threat was neutralized. The chaotic storm inside the hall abruptly settled. Howling winds died down, leaving only the distant, natural shrieking of the blizzard outside. Churning black smoke rapidly retracted, pulled violently backward, shrinking and compressing, until it slammed back into Cora's chest. Sudden silence was agonizingly heavy. Cora stood perfectly still in the dark corner. Violent, luminescent blue fire slowly faded from her human eyes, replaced by exhaustion. She raised her raw, burned hand. She wiped a single drop of black, viscous blood from her chin. Harlan Royce remained flat on his back in the center of the hall. He was bleeding from a dozen severe lacerations. He stared up at the girl he called a genetic defect. His empire was in ashes. His men were either dead or paralyzed by supernatural terror. The alpha hierarchy was completely, permanently broken. He waited for her to speak. He waited for her to demand his immediate submission. He expected her to plant her boot on his chest. He expected her to claim the territory, the surviving pack, and the entire timber estate as her own. It was the absolute law of their kind. The strongest ruled. Cora did not even look at him. She turned her back on the ruined alpha. She walked slowly toward a wooden peg near the shattered kitchen door. She reached up. She pulled her threadbare, patched winter coat from the hook. She slipped her bruised arms into the ragged wool sleeves, adjusting the collar against the biting cold. She walked back toward the center of the hall. She stepped cleanly over Harlan's bleeding body. She did not offer a single word of gloating. She did not offer an explanation. She did not demand a crown. She simply walked out the shattered mahogany doors and stepped into the freezing frontier. The heavy silence of the ruined estate settled firmly over the carnage. The only sound remaining was the steady, rhythmic crunch of Cora's boots in the fresh snow. The footsteps slowly faded into the howling winter wind. Harlan was left bleeding alone on the exact floor he once made her scrub.
As Cora walks away into the freezing unknown, leaving Harlan bleeding on the floor she used to scrub, drop a comment below and tell me exactly what city or country you are watching her journey from. If you want to follow her into the snow, hit the like button, share this story, and subscribe with the notification bell turned on so you never miss a step.